John Keats lived for a very short period. Born in 1795, he died in the year 1821. But within this very short span of life, and yet shorter span of what can be called a career, he left certain poems, especially, and also some letters, but it is primarily those poems which has allotted him lasting fame in the world of not only English literature but world literature. In a letter written in 1920 to Fanny Brawne, with whom he was secretly engaged, the truth came to be known much later. He was secretly engaged with her, and they were supposed to be married after his return from Rome, to which place he went to recover from tuberculosis. But unfortunately, it never happened. He couldn't return and died there. That is another story, very sad story altogether. In fact, that generation of romantic poets, the second generation, all of them were short lived. Generally, we talk about two trinities of romantic literature. The first set of trinity consists of Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. The second set, Byron, Keats, and Shelley, or rather Byron, Shelley, and Keats, they are all very short lived. Byron lived for 36 years, Shelley for 29, and Keats only 26 years. Anyway, in the letter that I was referring to, he told Fanny Brawne that I have loved the principle of beauty in all things, and if I had time, because he came to know by that time that he was not going to live long, I would have made myself remembered. That is, he had two desires. One is that of beauty, and the other is that of fame, which it seems he had given up on that desire because he thought he had not done enough to make his memories last. But posterity proved this thought of his to be wrong, and for all the better. If there is something like a soul or afterlife, possibly there is no such thing like that, but still, if something like that is there, he must be very happy now to see that his memory is rather shining bright in the entire realm of not only English literature, as I said, but world literature. Now, the key pointer with which we can assess Shelley's work is his quest for beauty. Yes, all of them are romantics. Blake, Wordsworth, Byron, Keats, Shelley, or Coleridge. But within that, there are degrees and differences. There are some commonalities are there, but then each had his specific eard. Wordsworth, for instance, had a deeply moral voice, which I would argue is even more sacrosanct to his writing than his love for nature. Nature is seen as a moral force. Coleridge, was always enticed by that idea of the supernatural, extraterrestrial, etc. So Byron was well known on those saga of extravaganza, love, etc. So on and so forth. Each had his own niche within the romantic gamut. Keats's favored domain was that of beauty. The relation between art and beauty, or nature and beauty, everything was subsumed to the concept of beauty. And for him, truth and beauty are inseparable. If something is really true, which is a tautology, or truly true, but we can't help it, then it must be beautiful, and vice versa. If something is beautiful, it must be true. That philosophy is expressed in a very succinct way in the poem that we are going to discuss now, Ode on a Grecian Urn. This is also important because I was looking at some of the YouTube videos where I have seen that done by non-Westerners, the very first stanza of the poem is grossly misinterpreted because some of them have understood canst to be cannot. That is wrong. So this is the poem. I mean, Grecian urn, urns are like vessels of Greek antiquity where there are pictures painted around all sides. Egypt also had a similar practice. In India, we also have. Similarly, if you look at some of those small pictures we call ghats used in certain pujas, they are decorated from, they are previously decorated. But this is not very common. Anyway, so he was just looking at an urn, and here we must tell you, he did not know Greek directly. I also don't know. But the Westerners, I mean in the Western world, it was then very necessary to be a scholar to learn Greek and Latin. But even Shakespeare didn't know small Latin and less Greek, which Ben Jonson said, which has been countered by some other critics later, but I think it is more or less true. So Keats did not have a very direct access to the Hellenic world. All he had at his disposal was a classical dictionary, as we have Oxford Classical Dictionary or Mythological Companion. From that, he deduced his idea of Greece. Just as we say that Shakespeare's, Roman citizens are more Elizabethan than Roman, but possibly it is all the better that they are like that. So if we try to extract a theory of how Greece actually was from Keats's poem, that would be wrong. That was not also his purpose. He just finds if something to be aesthetically beautiful, that must be truthful. Anyway, Ode on a Grecian Urn, it begins thus: Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhymes. So, thou still unravished bride of quietness. Obviously, here again a heteropatriarchal imagery, but virgins are supposed to be pure, unsullied, But we have to understand that Keats was born before the birth of feminism as such, so this may be allowed. So, virgin in the sense of fresh, because the actual meaning is that the urn has not been destroyed. Many other urns may have been destroyed, we don't have all the Grecian urns, but this one, or the ones like that have survived, have not been destroyed by time. So, thou still unravished bride of quietness, quiet, silent, the foster child of silence and slow time. Foster child, it must have been made by some artist, but who are its foster parents now? Silence and slow time. A sylvan historian, he calls the urn a historian. Sylvan is an adjective of forest, so a forest historian rather, who canst thus express, who can thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. He admits that the Grecian urn, or this urn from Greek antiquity, is expressing certain tales more beautifully than his own poems can. Alright, so here we have to go back to the Renaissance idea. You will find it in Sidney's Apology for Poetry. There was frequent parallels drawn between painting and poetry. It was said that painting is mute poetry and poetry is speaking picture. And Keats was also a master of imagery, visual imagery, auditory imagery, all kinds of imagery are frequent in his poems. So he says, what leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady. Asking the urn is a personification that what are the legends that have been drawn around your body? Do they depict gods? Do they depict humans, or do they depict both? This is an explanation, or rather, yes, practical application of Keats's own theory of negative capability, on which I will talk in a separate video. But in brief, the ability of a poet to remain in indecision. So you need not be very definitive, running after fact and reason. So there can be ambiguity. So he himself doesn't know. So what are this going on? It has several, paintings, themes that particular urn Keats is talking about. So we construct from it. On the one side, there are lovers pursuing beloveds with their tune, melodies, etc. Beloveds are, not responding as is usually done, but it has stopped there. In Hindi movies or even Bollywood movies or Titanic, this will be carried to the end. Finally, the girlfriend will accept, or boyfriend, both will be together and all that. But the urn, in a state that the things are, they have stopped there. The painting stops there. We do not know what happened later. So, a stasis. So, art has made the moment still. This is related to even Shakespeare's idea that art can immortalize love. Here, of course, painting is taken as an art. Shakespeare spoke of sonnet or writing as it. Please remember, all these romantics were heavily influenced by Shakespeare, overtly or covertly. So, even fair youth comes. So, in the second stanza, he says, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter, which we often use in a slightly out of the context way, often with a negative tone also, that what we know maybe is dangerous, but what we don't know is yet more dangerous. So we willfully misinterpret, but the original meaning is that you cannot understand or listen to the music that is being apparently played by the characters painted on the urn, because we can see they are playing but no audio, as we say there. Had it been today, so then audio file, video file, everything, and I think that way mysteries are gone. Everything is on record. Even that I am recording this, if YouTube doesn't delete and our internet doesn't crash, it will remain forever. But that takes away a lot of mystery from me also as a person, and from all those who do. It is better to remain partially ambiguous. Possibly it's my personal view, like Keats. So those pre-internet days were probably better. So Greeks had no internet, so they could not upload audio or video files, only picture files like JPEG images. So that can be taken as JPEG images around the urn. So their music you cannot, but you can just imagine that they must have been much better. That is the beauty of imagination. So in Indian mythology, the flute of Krishna, we exactly do not know the sound that it gave. We even are not sure whether Krishna is a mythological person or quasi-historical, etc., etc. But still, in the common psyche across religion, that flute of Krishna, that myth exists. It must have been very beautiful, which in a way becomes a symbol of universal lovers' flute. Anyway, but the actual Krishna's flute none of us have listened to. Some claim they have listened to, but that must have been a very personal experience with them. So for us it is unheard melodies. So that is why they are very sweet. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. So he encourages the players to their 4 pipes, soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit, ditties of no tone, ditties of no tone, tones of no tone, music of no tone. Very interesting oxymoron, paradox. So you have to understand by spirit, not by the ear, the music that is there on the urn. And then Fair youth beneath the trees, thou canst not leave, bold lover, nor ever can those trees be bare. In our day to day life, trees have fruit at some point of time bare. But painted trees, if painted with fruit, they will always remain fruitful in a way. So, bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal. So, is about to kiss, we assume, as is painted, but the kiss doesn't take place. He cannot kiss ever. That yet the beloved will also not become old, because they are caught in time by painting. So there is a stasis, I repeat. So unlike in the Titanic movie, where we see how the very famous actress Kate Winslet finally became old. Her old, finally means within the movie we see both, and their earlier romantic episode also. On the urn it is not possible. He is about to kiss, yet cannot kiss. This ambiguity. But then, no worry, this will go on like that, in that state, because the beloved also will not be old. So on and so forth, the poem proceeds. I will not elaborate too much on the subsequent stanzas. And then there is a reference to a sacrifice also. Another picture from the same series on the urn. There is a priest apparently leading a heifer for sacrifice. It's a cow which has not given birth to a calf actually. It's called heifer. We had this system in ancient India, but female things were in Indian tradition or Indian religion is prescribed to be sacrificed for obvious biological reason. It has to be the male one. So it can be a counter argument to feminist theories also, who always say that women are to be sacrificed in kinds of animals. Within Hinduism, sacrifice is always to be given to the males, he goat, like that. Anyway, so what little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is emptied of this folk, this pious morn, a morning scene. Apparently all people have come out of a city or a country. Which city, which country, he wants to know, but you do not know. We see only the present, but he wants to know of the absence. So much before Derrida, he talks about, trying to assess the absence by looking at what is present. What is present is a group of people being led by a priest towards the sacrifice of a heifer, but these people must have come from some town or country. Which are those? No answer. Then finally he says, O Attic shape, fair attitude, personified. That itself is a fair attitude, with bread of marble man and maiden overwrought. Man and women overwrought, overworked on it. Overworked in the literary sense, not in today's sense of being exhausted. Worked over, hence overworked or overwrought. With forest branches and trodden weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity. So this art, you see the magnanimity or the spirit, cosmic spirit of Gibbs, as good as a saint. Finally seeing this, he is connected to the cosmos, the universe, eternity. So the painting on the urn, with its artistic stasis or staticness, quote unquote, stasis means staticness, but aesthetic staticness. Staticness is not a correct word I am using for making you understand, my students. So stasis, aesthetic stasis that has been generated by the painter on the Grecian urn is as good as eternity, because it will remain forever. Of course, if you want to break it and disprove it, then you take and break it. But which one? You exactly do not know which urn it is. It may not be one particular urn, maybe 2-3 urns is so and combined. Because poetic truth, the main target is beauty, not actual truth like history, geography, etc. We have this entire gamut of discussion of poetic truth and factual truth, starting from Plato in the Western history and starting from Vedas in the Indian history. Ekam sad vipraha bahudha vadanti. The truth is one, but the wise call it by different names. Anyway, cold pastoral, he says, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours. Old age shall this generation waste. That is, time will come and all this generation who are my friends, families, will die, including me. As true of kids as of today. You know, till the great global leaders invent some machine which won't allow people to die, death is the only certainty and reality we have. But at the same time, other people will continue till the dissolution of the world, which doesn't seem to be very near anyway. So the urn then will tell the same stories to that generation also. And what will be its message? Keats gives it for us. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty, within course. That is all you know on earth, and all you need to know. Beautiful, superb. You need not know all this kind of data entry operator, this and that, how much wealth does one have, how many people have this car, that car. I mean, poetic view, Keats's view. So whatever is beautiful, you find beautiful, accept is as true. So beauty is truth comes first, not truth is beauty. So though they are same, but then first it has to be beautiful, then only it can be true. So it's very much comparable to the Indian idea of the Supreme as Satchidananda, as Upanishads define, Adi Shankara reinterpreted, and in the previous century both Sri Aurobindo and Rabindranath, please reread his Religion of the Forest, Satchidananda again and again. Sat means akin to true, Shatya. Shat originally actually meant eternal, but then reduced means Sat. Chit means consciousness. So Sat and Chit more or less combine to make what Keats means by truth, and Ananda, beauty, pleasure, Satchidananda. Or another modern critic, Ananda Kumar Swami, his name itself is Ananda, coined this term Satyam Shivam Sundaram, which is a combination of Satchidananda and Keats's truth and beauty. This is an important thing you learn today. This Satyam Shivam Sundaram, many people think it is from our antiquity scriptures. No, it is coined by Ananda Kumar Swami in the 20th century, of course based on our antiquity. So whatever is Satya means truth, must be Shivam. Shivam means blissful. The etymological meaning of Shiva is blissful. Shivamastu, if we say in Sanskrit, means all be well with you. You means Shivamastu. Satyam Shivam Sundaram, beautiful. So all this together make one. So truth and beauty are same and the one for Keats. Beauty is truth. So you can counter this, you can question this by many things, but just as I said earlier, it has to be understood by spirit. It cannot be explained by making a chart, making signs, or so like that. Why a particular person falls in love with another particular person, a boy with a girl, or boy with a boy, girl with a girl. They do not fall in love with all attraction. So there's particular reason which cannot be conclusively explained. Science is trying different things, chemistry, etc. But finally this cannot be. So one picture which one finds very beautiful even may not be found beautiful too. I'm now talking beyond Keats. So Keats's argument, or Anand Kumar Swami's argument, or Indian Upanishads argument about Satchidananda, that is whatever is true must be beautiful, full of pleasure. It must have to be understood at the level of spirit, rather not only understand, feeling, experience. It cannot be explained rationally, perhaps. So in this video I have rather gone against what I have taught and discussed in my other videos as political reading. I wanted this one to be an example of aesthetic reading. We have almost forgotten now. So I think you would like it differently. differently. So you can bring in political criticism also, but remember, he died only when he was 26 years old. Had he been allowed even a Shakespeare's lifetime, then much more things could have come. But we are satiated, I think, if we read with heart with whatever Keats has given us. Thank you very much.